Osiem, Tenoya, Tenoan Sayam and Siaya, Sayoyaqua, Tlachin Newman, One Hot and Squalwin, Nata Uns, Latash Grshamin, Tanalachan, Osahano Kameo, Sko Omashoth. Greetings to all of you. I will now share a welcome song from the Squamish Nation. The song belongs to the Matthias family. I have the honor to share the song with you today. OCM. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho hey 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 a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho hey 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 a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho hey 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 a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho ho che hey a chaya. Ho hey 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 a chaya. Awesome. Hoshka Tanoya.
Tansinin Boujou. Hello, my name is Craig Settee. I'm the coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council, known as IPERC, at the CanSolve CKD network. I'd like to acknowledge and give thanks to all those who were involved in the creation of the video that welcomes us and starts us on this journey of land acknowledgements and highlighting the importance and relevance of land acknowledgements. To introduce the framework of this learning series called Supporting Each Other's Journey, I'm going to share the 4 L's as directed by the Wabishke Bijigoskanj Learning Pathway and also part of the training and mentorship efforts of the CanSolve CKD network. The 4 L's are looking, listening, learning, and leading, and each of the following sessions will cover one of these L's. The 4th webinar is leading, and in this webinar I will be summarizing some key points from the previous 3 webinars, and I'll also be encouraging this land acknowledgement series as a first step in many that can lead to better cultural humility and cultural competency. Tansinin Boujou. I'm Craig Settee. I'm the coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council here at the CanSolve CKD network. I'm sharing these messages with you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, home of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm an uninvited guest in these territories, and I'm originally from Manitoba. Today, I'll be covering webinar 4 of the Supporting Each Other's Journey Land Acknowledgement Learning Series. I give thanks to the knowledge keepers, Latash Maurice Nahani, for the welcome song he has shared with us to start off each of the webinars in this series. I raise my hands to Latash and say Chimigwech. On the next slide, I'll give a brief overview of our time together for this webinar. Here's a brief overview of the webinar for today. Miigwech again to Latash for the welcome song. I'll give a summary with some key points from each of the previous 3 webinars to refresh our memories. Webinar 4, Leading, is where I will share thoughts on taking responsibility to lead the path forward. To wrap up the 4th webinar and the learning series, information on the guidebook to follow along as you continue to learn about the land and territories we all live upon and take this first step in starting or continuing to craft land acknowledgements in personal and professional circles. The final message is the land acknowledgement video. I'm grateful to Harley and the panelists, Amit, Joanne, Ken, and Mila, for sharing their vulnerability to look within and reflect on the questions and experiences of doing land acknowledgements and learning more about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories on which each of them live. Part of the key themes that emerged from this session was discomfort, and it's important to acknowledge these feelings because this is where humility stimulates growth of cultural awareness and competency. A question that often arises when folks begin to continue looking within on this journey is, where do I start? Well, educational institutions and Indigenous friendship centers across the country have many resources available that have local context of First Nations, Inuit, or Métis territory and the history in your region. I encourage you to look into these resources. I'd like to share a little bit about what Knowledge Keepers Latash Maurice Nahani and Dr. Myra Laramie shared in webinar 2. Latash discussed importance of re-examining history and effects of foreign policies like the Royal Proclamation, the British North America Act, and the Indian Act, which all have lasting effects that continue to affect Indigenous nations and the people of the lands we live on. Latash also shared about protocols on visiting neighboring nations from the perspective of Squamish peoples. Knowledge Keeper Myra shared beautiful teachings on the Great Binding Law. These are not only teachings, but Indigenous laws on conducting ourselves in the relationships with Mother Earth and all other beings that exist with us physically and spiritually. This webinar is very special, and I'm honored Latash and Myra came to share teachings for us to listen closely and understand a little bit more about how their teachings relate to acknowledging Mother Earth and the original nations and people whose territories we continue to live on. In webinar 3, Letitia shared beautiful teachings on the history of her perspective as an Inuvialuit person on her family history, significance of the land, land stewardship, and land dispossession. The connections to water was a theme that really stood out. What I appreciated as well were the points that she made about the health of the land affecting the health of people. A quote from Letitia's ancestor, Bertram Pokiap, stating, "The North is my bank," reminded me of something a knowledge keeper from back in Manitoba shared. The late Mark Thompson Abun used to say, "The land is my pharmacy," because he was a highly regarded medicine person who could doctor people with plant medicine and spiritual connection. The second speaker, Helen, shared good teachings that the land is also our water. The circle work and the sharing her story by navigating the physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental journey around the circle was very profound. Thinking of the next 7 generations also provided great teaching that the young ones in our families will also be carrying this act of acknowledging land, water, and history and connections to Indigenous territories. I want to take this time to share a little bit about myself by introducing myself in Anishinaabe before moving on to the next sections. Sagasteo Napeo Indigenous Makwan and Dem, Ochegwisipi, Shigo Winnipeg and Dunjiba, Nehino, Shigo Anishinaabe Nindao. My name, Sagasteo Napeo, means sun rays shining through the clouds man. Makwa, the bear, is my kinship clan, and I come from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I'm also a member of Ochegwisipi, which is also known as Fish River Cree Nation. Doing this introduction of where I come from and also adding what lands, territories I currently live on is helpful in creating space. The picture in this slide is taken at Fisher River, Cree Nation during the annual Treaty Days. I participated in the York boat races and you can see me rowing just right of the fellow standing there in red. I wanted to share this as an example of my connection to the land and water in my home territory. Doing a land acknowledgement for the Métis Nation can be challenging. This is because traditional Métis settlements are dispersed across Canada. The Métis homeland encompasses 3 prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as well as parts of Ontario, British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, and the Northern United States. Métis chartered communities are formal regional communities established by provincial or territorial Métis Nation leadership. Typically, chartered communities are self-governed by an executive elected by Métis citizens who live within the community's boundaries. Métis chartered communities are similar in structure to the system of Canadian provincial and municipal governments. On the territory of the Métis Nation, we simply speak of territory, not traditional territory. In consultation with local Métis associations, you can include the Métis people where appropriate. Among Inuit, the tradition of acknowledging territory does not exist. However, Inuit Nunavut consists of 4 regions: Nunavut, Nunavik in Quebec, Nunatsiavut in Labrador, and Inuvialuit in the Northwest Territories and Yukon. The wording of First Nations territorial acknowledgements will depend on whether there is a modern treaty or territorial agreement or not between the nation and Canada. Next, I want to share a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. The TRC calls to action are in the Canadian context and apply to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. I wanted to share 2 specific calls to action. Although call to action number 24 refers to health, there are other calls to action that address some of the other sectors like child welfare, education, justice, and others. Under the health calls to action, number 24 states, we call upon medical and nursing schools in Canada to require all students to take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. And this learning series is also a lesson in intercultural competency. The next TRC call to action I wanted to share takes us from the local to the global context as well. Call to action number 43. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a framework for reconciliation. This segue makes the connection from local to a more global movement in UNDRIP for calls to adopt and implement all of the articles from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There are a number of articles in UNDRIP that address Indigenous lands, and I wanted to point out 2 specifically. What we have heard in the previous 3 webinars also touch upon these points. Article number 25. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. As well, Article 26(1) says, Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Article 25(2), Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. I encourage you to dig into the TRC and UNDRIP in reflection. I'd like to share a quick story about also bearing witness to a welcome to country when I attended the First Nations session on kidney health in Melbourne, Australia at the 2019 World Congress of Nephrology. Indigenous peoples are stewards of care and caretakers of the traditional territories across the globe. It was really good to see this session start off in this way, and a number of folks acknowledged the original peoples and lands that we were meeting on when we met in Melbourne, Australia. So that land acknowledgements do not only take place in Canada, but they take place on Indigenous lands across the globe. Circle work is an Indigenous framework. It has also been called medicine wheel. As you'll see in the diagram in this slide, the circle shows the 4 L's that are the foundation of the Wabashke Bijigo Skanj learning pathway and also guide this series. In the context of land acknowledgements, taking responsibility to look, listen, learn, and lead personal, professional, and organizational efforts to create, adapt, and use land acknowledgements. The circle can also represent mind, body, spirit, emotion. Other layers of this circle can be directions like east, south, west, north, medicine teachings, animal teachings, and others. You may remember Helen sharing through a circle teaching and knowledge keeper Myra reminding us that the circle also teaches us of balance and harmony as another layer. Indigenous health can be tied to access to the land, water, and air. The next slide will share a little bit more about land access and dispossession from an Indigenous leader. An excerpt from the Canadian Dimension online version with the late Secwepemc leader Arthur Manuel. For all the talk about First Nations economic development, the focus of governments and the public is only ever on what Arthur called the 0.2% economy. That figure represents the total land base covered by Indian reserves in Canada. It is a tiny amount of space for more than 600 First Nations, especially given the enormous landmass of Canada. The vast majority of this country is sparsely populated. So why have the Indigenous peoples been denied jurisdiction over most of their lands? According to Arthur, Indigenous people must rely on the 0.2% economy because they have been denied rights to the 99.8% economy, which is largely reserved for provinces to lease, permit, and license forestry, mining, and energy resources. They want First Nations people reliant on the 0.2% economy. You can read more in Arthur Manuel's book, Unsettling Canada, A National Wake-Up Call. Land acknowledgements are a first step and a baseline for supporting each other's journey to learn, but also to take a responsibility to take action. Many Indigenous folks are calling for movement beyond acknowledging Indigenous lands to returning Indigenous lands to Indigenous communities and nations in the land back movement. I support non-Indigenous people to do land acknowledgements, but also to continue learning while also being cognizant of the additional steps to allyship and supporting each other's journey can be supporting Indigenous community and environmental activism in your areas. The last piece I'll leave you with is a personal act I do when I'm out on the land or on the water. As a Cree and Anishinaabe person, tobacco is often used as an offering when asking for guidance, giving thanks, or other reasons depending on community teachings. Part of my maintaining relationship with Mother Earth is giving thanks to the spiritual and physical sustenance that she provides, which helps my emotional and mental parts of my circle as well. Land acknowledgement is not only words, it's action. The guidebook is used in conjunction with the webinars and outlines some of the key questions posed to the speakers of each webinar. It is our hope that the guidebook aids in the crafting or adding to a land acknowledgement in the context of Indigenous nations in the territory you reside or are meeting. Miigwech, kinanaskimit nawao. Thank you for taking the time to look, listen, and learn. Leading is another step in the journey. My contact information is provided if you'd like to reach out to me. You can also visit the Indigenous Health page at the CanSolve CKD website. We will now share the land acknowledgement video narrated by Mary Beaucage to continue encouraging all of us to support each other's journey in land acknowledgements and learning local contexts and histories of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities and territories that we all live on. Which.
Acknowledging the land is a First Nations tradition that goes back generations. It's a means of rooting yourself in the place that you gather. Traditional greetings will vary by region, but generally mention who I am, where do my people or family come from, what is my purpose, where am I going, and thanking the land and nature that is hosting you. Here is my example. Mary Beaucage Nishtikaz, Bising Dunjaba, Robinson Huron Treaty Nunjaba. My name is Mary Beaucage. I'm from Nipissing First Nation and Robinson Huron Treaty Territory in northeastern Ontario, and this is my homeland. Land acknowledgements are not exclusive to one group or side. We are all treaty people. If you live on this land, you are part of a treaty relationship. It's imperative that you prepare a land acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is one step to relearn the diverse nations that existed and continue to exist across Canada. The British Crown and First Nations negotiated and signed many treaties before Confederation. The intent of these treaties was to deliver mutual benefits. First Nations signed as independent, self-governing nations. Although many treaties were signed more than a century ago, treaty commitments are just as valid today as they were then. They are meant to be upheld and stewarded by us and our generations before and after. Language is important. We are not Indians, Aboriginal, or Native. Think of it this way. Indigenous is an umbrella term, and under it, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. All are unique. All have differing relationships and history with the Government of Canada and the provinces. It is up to you to learn about this. The land acknowledgement that you create has to come from a good place. It can be as long or as short as you feel is right for you. It can include history or facts that you've learned. It shouldn't be solemn. It should be uplifting and positive. Your acknowledgement is a living statement and should be written in present tense. Land acknowledgements can seem intimidating at first. It might take you out of your comfort zone. If you're in a situation where each person is stating their city and territory and you reside in the same area as them, it's important for each of us to say it, even if it seems repetitive. The city and territory each bear equal weight. The more you say it, the easier it becomes and you will feel more comfortable. Once you feel that comfort, take the next step. Move on from reading a pre-scripted land acknowledgement and include your own reflections. You will become a leader in this practice. As an Anishinaabe woman, I appreciate you doing the work and hearing you share your acknowledgement. It is very important and meaningful to me. Do I want to speak up and help you pronounce words that are foreign to you? Yes. But as a mother watches her baby walk, I have to let you learn. Regarding pronunciation, I sometimes think of using big, long technical terms. If you can learn to say complex terms, the name of a territory you live on can be learned as well. Don't shy away from using proper names in your acknowledgement. They add significance and decrease the erasure of Indigenous nations and their territories and homelands. Indigenous languages are beautiful and descriptive. The words can also be tricky. Phonetic pronunciations are available, and so are people who can help you with words and names. Take some time and visit an Indigenous Friendship Center or contact a nearby community. Reach out to colleagues. Ceremonies and gatherings can be opportunities to connect with people in the land. There's a tangible relationship that can take place, and provide meaningful connections. Go with a humble heart, and don't be afraid to ask. People will always guide you. My challenge to you is to find out what treaty territory you live on. Why is that treaty or unceded territory significant? Take those teachings and use them to help you foster your relationship to the land and the Indigenous peoples in your area. This is one small step towards reconciliation. A young knowledge keeper said that we will be ancestors one day, and our actions and inactions will affect the ones to come. It's always stuck with me because we think of the 7 generations before us and the 7 generations after with every action we take or decision we make. Miigwech.